First thing, I guess I've thrown up this little square of little QR code, or as I got referred to as robot bar. If you like to scan this, because I am sitting here in the afternoon after we've had lunch and we've gone through all these presentations today, I'm actually going to be showing quite a bit of code. So feel free to drift off or stare off into space after a while. This QR code will actually take you to a GitHub repository that has everything I'm going to talk about, including a Vagrant environment where you can stand this up and watch it. Okay. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about custom types and providers. Quick thing about this, just out of curiosity, has anybody ever written a custom type or provider for Puppet? Fantastic. We've got a couple. Anybody completely baffled to what a custom type and provider might possibly be? Okay, somebody can be baffled. That's okay. So what this is a little bit of how you go about extending Puppet. That sounds scary. How do you go about extending something that I download it, I create the DSL code, and I run it? Why would I want to extend it? That's what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. It's not so scary. It's really not so scary. It's not bad. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Chad Thompson. I am a quote-unquote DevOps engineer. And for those who are, I know it's on my paycheck. But that's my title, and I'm with Dice Holdings. We're a global company. We're based in Urbandale, Iowa. I got up this morning and flew here to Chicago to talk today. Dice Holdings, you may know some of our brands. Dice.com is the big one you may have heard of. You may have heard of us through Dice.com, any one of our sub-brands. We also have a number of industry-specific job boards. So if you work for the government, you may have heard of clearance jobs, where we post job openings and candidates who have security clearances with the United States government. We have a few others. Or you may know us as the corporate overlords of Slashdot. If you take a moment and participate in Flame War, that's the way too. So that's in a nutshell who I am. You can find out more mind-numbingly detail about me than you'd ever want to know in my website there. I've also got links to this presentation and everything as well if you need those or didn't catch the robot bar from the first slide. So some of you here are beginners to Puppet. Some of you have a little bit more experience. I guess I can kind of trace my own path of learning Puppet through all of this. So it always kind of starts off. In some of my first Puppet, it was very simple. Matter of fact, the first time I got into using Puppet was when I was working as a Java developer. I took a contract with a state agency working on a system that was hosted on a Windows server, but more importantly, it was a Java platform that was running a application server that was running on Java 5. The machine I was doing all my development on was OS 10. And if you've ever done Java development on OS 10, so Java 1.5, and in this Java 1.5 code base, there's all kinds of stuff that's calling com.sun packages, all the stuff you're not supposed to do. So you look for the Java 1.5 JDK, and you pop open OS 10, and every single JDK has that little symbolic link arrow that points to Java 1.6. So there's many things that simply wouldn't run. So we needed to come up with a way that myself and 3 other developers were all working on MacBooks could essentially stand up and share virtual environments to be able to do Java development with Java 1.5 on OS 10. So we started using Puppet and Puppet files to share these things with source control, rather than the old method of passing around the USB stick with a virtual machine on it that just never was quite up to date. Puppet, we could rebuild these things every time to have a consistent development environment that kind of reflected this really strange deployment environment that we were deploying code to. Another story, what did I say about the beer thing? All right. Good. So it kind of starts off with, so the first thing that you probably started running is you start off with the old site.pp Puppet manifest. It's very simple. If you're like me, you even said, well, hey, I'm going to run everything in the default node because I don't need to define anything else. And then define a few resources. From there, you might kind of pick up on the notion that, hey, I've got so many things that are reusable. let's start developing modules out of these things. Taking that single manifest and then creating reusable modules you can plug in everywhere else. So from this one file comes to you're getting into reusable code. We saw a little bit about modules this morning. Now after kind of using modules for a little bit, you see this need for a few things where you're like, hey, I keep doing this one activity over and over and over and over again that's not module specific. So the Puppet DSL has a concept of defined types, where you can, rather than define a module, you can instead define a specific type that's part of a module. In this case, there's a custom mod config. Essentially, in programming language terms, it's almost like a function. These things happen again and again and again. If you use some of the Puppet mod or Puppet Forge modules, especially the Apache module, probably use the Apache vhost define type, again and again and again. It's defining virtual hosts, but it does the same thing all the time, and that's what a defined type is. So there are some things that you find that the Puppet DSL especially is really good at. Kind of going back to my, me being a DevOps engineer, I kind of come from the dev side more than I do the ops side. So I was used to making our operations staff hell. Now I'm in that position, so I repent as much as I often can. But so one of the things that you kind of notice about the Puppet DSL that Puppet does really well is it does encapsulation very well. When you write a Puppet module or Puppet manifest, in this example, defining a user, this single resource call to create a user, using my name, whatever it might be, this actually will work on Linux, it'll work on BSD, it'll work on Solaris, and it works on Windows. It's kind of amazing if you think about it. It's a lot of tasks that go on, and a lot of, essentially a lot of code underneath a very simple abstraction. So creating a user in the Puppet DSL becomes nicely encapsulated. The other thing that I think this morning there was a question about why would you decide to use Puppet over some other technology like shell scripts or Chef or things like this. And one of the things that's rather unique about Puppet, and one of the strengths in my opinion, is Puppet's very strong idea of dependency management. You can have resources that depend upon each other, but if they don't depend on each other, they can be separate. So if you've ever noticed when you do a Puppet agent run on a bunch of resources that are separate, they all kind of run in parallel. They don't run at the same time. So your runs happen much quicker. Those things in parallel a little bit. This can also be the biggest cause of any bug you'll write in Puppet code is realize that one dependent, you've missed a dependency in there. But Puppet's dependency graph is really a very powerful feature. And when you write modules and you're using modules and Puppet classes to define things, at least in my opinion, I've always found that to be much easier and cleaner to understand than some of the things like the Ansible and Salt ways of doing kind of the running things in order per se. Because sometimes things aren't dependent, and you just like to make sure that they don't necessarily need to be dependent. But the problem is when you introduce these kinds of things, there's certain things, and many of you probably have done this. I know this, I like to say starting out, but there's still times when I do this. Puppet is not very good in the DSL at doing procedural things. You have various kinds of things where there's a certain number of steps that you need to do in order. I mean, you can set up the dependencies here. Here's an example of setting up these dependencies where you say, okay, I need to execute this, then this, then this, then this. Either you get into this thing where you're saying exact, and putting all these arrows in to make sure that, well, I got to create this, and then I need to do this, and then I need to do this, and then I need to do this. As a matter of fact, this is an example of, this was actually setting up an SSH path for a user, copying keys and things like that. So, the tricks become either doing lots of execs with arrows in them, or maybe doing one exec and being very cute in this big long, almost feels like the old days of when we first started doing web programming with Perl, and you write this big long nasty expression, and you go, oh, it just creates the whole page. That's really kind of it's one of those things. Once you start doing that, you realize that one of the neat things about Puppet is its simplicity. But when you start having to be cute with shell scripting inside a single command in a Puppet manifest, suddenly your simplicity kind of vanishes in this Perlish haze. it says the very definition of hell is reading somebody else's curl code. The same thing applies for that one long exec string floating out there. So let's say, the difficult things in Puppet, is sometimes, so, for one example, I do a lot of management of scripting environments. For example, we've got, two entire brands that use PHP. So we manage PHP versions using Git tags, Git repositories. Matter of fact, using the Puppet VCS repo module. Very handy for, tagging a repository, grabbing a specific version. But a lot of these, products also have other needs that have to happen. Once we change a version, we need to execute few deployment scripts. Some of these are like warming up caches, it's compiling CSS, it's adding version numbers to certain things to make the application, this combination of PHP and the PHP Laravel frameworks. To make those things work, there's certain things that need to run. So there's could be this list of these PHP artisan commands that happen. The other thing that of course, sometimes comes with a lot of these languages when you go to different environments is you may update code and then wish to run a database migration. In some of those steps, you can do this again in Puppet, the exact thing, but it can leave you in a state where if something fails, you don't have a good rollback. If you have a good script that can do all of these native database things, a lot of you are probably familiar with these kinds of things. If something bombs in the database thing, you don't want to leave your database table sitting in a corrupt state while your Puppet run failed. Again, you'd like to have something happen here that allows you to kind of get back to it, make sure the site is still up, it's still functional, and not cause problems. So a lot of times you want to execute these database migrations, and if the migration fails, do something to go back to a best known state and come back and resolve the problem. The other thing that can be difficult with the Puppet DSL itself is sometimes if you have any custom third-party integrations that need to happen. And this can be anything from maybe something you purchased. We have there's one deployment that we do when we do a code deployment, execute a database migration. There's kind of the same, before we do this database migration, there's a desire to do a little bit of reporting based on what data is in there. So it's kind of okay, well, it's good enough just before this database migration kicks in, execute this little database query, report, format it, and send me a HipChat message. That can be kind of difficult to do with the DSL itself. The other things that could be in there are even if you have APIs that you've developed yourself, that for whatever reason, as part of the deployment process, you need to either warm up caches, perhaps, or kind of reach out and touch these other systems. So these are the kinds of things where, as a new Puppet user, and I was definitely in this boat, you kind of get in and say, well, Puppet just can't do that. I need to do something else, and that something else even turned into the kind of thing like, okay, I'm going to do VCS repo, and then I'm going to notify something that's going to run this shell script. Then what happens when that shell script runs? You have to worry about where the output of that shell script ends up. Not necessarily always part of this. When we get into the package of using Puppet, we want to use the reporting features. We want to use Puppet DB. We want to use the dashboard and know everything that's in our system. And if we kind of leave that runtime to run shell scripts, you have to worry about where you're capturing and logging that output. Again, now you've got something outside of Puppet, things become hard to manage. There is, however, a different way of doing this. With the Puppet language, you're kind of given a number of hooks to extend the Puppet runtime and to use it for different things. So, for example, here is a tool that I use quite often. We have a number of content websites that use WordPress. And at this point, we're managing well north of 40 of these. It can be, if you've ever used WordPress, anybody used WordPress here? I'm sure quite a few. So the challenge with maintaining and keeping WordPress up to date is always, you got to kind of log in and go through the administration GUI and click certain things and find the right plugin updates. There's actually a very nice tool that if you've never heard of it, it will change your life when it comes to WordPress development or administration. The way it's changed my life is I'm doing less WordPress administration, which is a good thing. And the tool is called the WordPress command line interface, wpcli.org. And one of the things that you can do with this, and is for this example, you kind of note I have a different resource up here. Rather than something that looks like user file, I've got this odd type called WP CLI. That doesn't ship with Puppet. It doesn't really ship on the Forge at the moment either. I kind of apologize to the Puppet folks. I should probably put that in there someday. But a way to use the WP CLI to do certain functions. In this case, here I am actually just installing the thing and putting it in path. So the way to do this is to define what's called a custom type. And that's what this is, a custom type that defines what the type name is. In this case, you saw the name of that was WP CLI. I define a custom type and a custom provider. A type does the definitions, the provider does all of the actions. So a custom type and provider is the way to extend Puppet to make it do things that kind of seem outside of what you may be familiar with just using the Puppet DSL. A quick bit of background. So this is not scary. It seems scary. I mean, this once you kind of get into extending Puppet, here I was digging through Safari books online and get worried that this was going to be extraordinarily difficult. It's not. It's doable. First of all, how many of you are devoted, dedicated Rubyists? The Ruby programming language inside and out. Anybody? All right, well, good. Here's the other nice thing. You don't necessarily need to be. The Ruby syntax that you kind of use to extend Puppet looks very shell scripting. So if you've done shell scripting, you've got Perl, you've got Python, the little bit of Ruby you need to know to do these things is not that difficult. As a matter of fact, you'll do a few basic things. You can also get into many other things. Once you get into the language runtime, you have the full power of the Ruby programming language. So libraries, objects, gem files, go on. Many different things. Not scary. Again, not scary. It's just a little bit of Ruby. We all use it a little bit. And then there's also many different ways you can create a type. The demonstration I have here today, and the saw the little URL of my GitHub account, is actually just it is a custom type that has a single provider. And if there's to be, while I'm doing some of these things with all of my, all these applications and doing deployments and things like that, really this is kind of the use case I have. Is I have a type and then I usually have a provider that does all of the work. When you go out to the Puppet Forge, you'll see some of these things also be developed. And if you're somebody that's developing a product, per se, that somebody else uses in different environments versus our example where we run websites and we have a certain control over what goes on, you can use different factor facts, different features to look at what your operating system is, what your runtime environment is, and what provider you're going to plug in. So if you're doing a lot of things, for example here when I'm doing some PHP runtimes and all these kinds of things, essentially Ubuntu will refer to things as PHP5-CLI, where Red Hat may just refer to as PHP-CLI. There's things like that. You can use these providers and features to test for what your operating system is and where you're running your custom provider. In most cases that I've dealt with, being in a position where we run websites and have a fairly limited architecture. We kind of run Ubuntu and Red Hat. We don't have these edge cases of running Solaris machines, SUSE Linux, anything like that. There's a little bit of control. So sometimes one provider is good enough to do the tasks that we need to do. The other thing to kind of keep in mind, so when you get started with this, and docs.puppetlabs.com, again, which is going to be your friend, when I first started doing this, the documentation wasn't great. So it took me a long time to kind of work through and find examples and figure that there is a kind of a convention for this new directory. When you create a module now, you'll have a new directory in your module called the lib directory. So when you create a module, you essentially add just another new directory that defines a custom type in the provider that can go along with all of your other module files. So if you're creating a module, for example, that's doing a specific kind of deployment for a website that you're maintaining or something like that, you'll have all of your Puppet DSL code that's doing all the same things you're already doing today. Defining files, checking out things, making changes to services and all those types of things. But then you can also just kind of, you don't have to do anything special here. You just create the LIB directory, along with a couple Ruby files that define your custom type and your custom provider. In this case, there's only one type, and it's named wp-cli.rb, and there is one provider, and it's just called ruby.rb, which is something of a convention per se. So one type, one provider, and an LID is part of the module directory that you're already using. So take a quick look here inside what the type is. So you take a look at it. Type definition is actually fairly simple. The first thing you're going to notice, and actually all of the types that I've created use this little tag where this type is what's called an insurable type. And what that insurable type means is that when you write these things in the DSL language and you type, you're probably all used to saying, okay, type, user, so-and-so name, ensure HashRocket present, or ensure true, created, installed, whatever that might be. This enables that ensure tag. So your custom type now uses that ensure tag, and that's what you're going to use to make sure that every time you run this special, so you've created this scripted Ruby, and you want to make sure that it is, idempotent. It doesn't, magically do things again and again and again. You want to make sure that the action you've taken is something that you won't be doing for multiple Puppet runs. So, for example, in this case, if you're installing the WP CLI, if it's already there on your system, don't do it again. Just kind of say, no, it's already there. I can, move on. Special little warning here. Of course, where this gets kind of tricky is when you're being cute with managing files, and you decide, hey, I'm going to append a line on a file, and this thing starts running again and again and again. Your configuration file may either confuse the service that it's part of, or if it just keeps running again and again and again, and the doors changes, it may fill up disk space. I don't know how that happens. Never done that. Not going to confess. So, custom type. So the insurable type is what we use for this idempotency. There's going to be a function we use called exists that's going to let us determine whether what we want to do has been done. If it has been done, don't do it again. The other things that are involved in these custom types is also defining parameters and properties. And these are the kinds of things that when you see kind of all these types, with, so you go to docs.puppetlabs.com and you look up the file type, and there's all these parameters you can pass to it. This is where you start defining the parameters for your custom type. In this case, there's only one of them. I'm defining an install path. Kind of cheap and cheesy here, but it's an install path, and then there also has to be one name variable. And what a name variable means is this thing has to be unique. So when you define these things, and you can define it a couple times. But as you probably noticed, if you've done things with the Puppet CLI, once you start defining something that has the same name, you get the error back that says, hey, this has already been defined, I don't know what to do with it. So this name variable is kind of what ensures that what we do is unique. Now, jumping into the second part of this, the provider. So the type, the type is essentially, if you're used to object-oriented programming, the type is the interface to our object. And our provider here is the specific instantiation of a class, per se. So the type defines what it looks like, and the provider defines what it does. Now, for an insurable type, there's actually a couple of things that are enforced here. One of these being, kind of bolded down on the end. There's a one here called definition exists. This is a Ruby function that every time this type is executed, every time I call WP CLI, this little exist function is going to run. And the purpose of this exists function is simply to find out whether or not I have an executable installed called WP. If I have that executable, then I'm going to skip over the whole thing and say, nope, I've already got it, I'm done, we're good. We don't need to do anything with this, and essentially the program will exit, the Puppet run will continue on unabated, per se. If it does not exist, if I can't find this executable, and that's what this little chunk of Ruby is doing, is looking for this executable. Is this thing called WP there? If it's not there, then we need to move on to another function called create. And create is kind of where the magic happens. So if it doesn't exist, create it. Do the thing you need to do. So in this case, really what it's doing, we're going to use a little bit of the Ruby language here to do a little bit of file manipulation. First of all, we're going to download something from the internet. We'll grab something from wp-cli.org. grab a package, download it to a location, and then change the permissions to executable. So this is actually a very simple example. There are a couple features here that may look a little weird. The first one being, if you kind of see this thing where I'm defining where I curl, and there's a curl, and there's a open parentheses and a bracket and a dash O. That's actually a little bit of special syntax here that's calling an executable. And if you kind of look in there, there's something on the top. Point this right here. You kind of see this. We're calling something called commands. That's actually another nice little validation step that's provided as part of all of this. So if I can define a command and say that if I need to run this provider, the system better have curl on it. Otherwise, I can't do anything. So it's actually a little bit of a check here to say that if this command called curl is not installed, well, then the provider has to fail because it can't really do anything. It doesn't have access to that system executable. So when you're actually writing this, you're going to have a couple dependencies. Your WP CLI object is going to have a couple dependencies on curl and PHP. This is a way of defining it where it will error out. You'll see that in your Puppet runs. Hey, to run this thing, I need to have curl installed. If you've used modules off of the Forge, you've probably seen some of those errors as well, where this package has to depend on that one. It may kind of be outside of the normal package management routines. So really, that was kind of a brief introduction to custom types and providers. So if there is going to be a conclusion to this one, it's going to be the whole, how do I mix scripting with Puppet? How do I do these things that don't really seem to fit in Puppet? Write a custom type, write a provider. This will allow you to do all of those tasks. The kind of don't seem to fit. It's the warming the caches, it's contacting APIs, it's installing things in ways that the Puppet the DSL may not provide. For example, in this case, curling something isn't really part of the DSL. It kind of allows you to do that with a custom type and provider. So with that, I guess I've kind of wrapped all of this up in a very kind of a short way. Any questions? I guess this is quite a bit in a short amount of time. There's many of them. Sir?
Do you have access to other items in the catalog during the website of the custom type? So like the common problem constantly solving is like I can't export data, I can only export resources. So I end up exporting a bunch of file resources.
So the question was, while a custom provider is running, do I have access to the resources defined in the catalog? It's like, and the answer is yes, you do. The second answer is like, I can't answer that right offhand, so just look it up kind of thing. It's one of those little hashes that's in there. Like in this case, you may have seen that the parameter name was a resource name. There's another API that's similar to that that allows you to access things that are outside of the provider. Again, you may need to put a little, like the little commands thing, you may need to have a dependency. So if that dependency isn't met, then fail. But yeah, that's actually in there in the API. Docs.puppetlabs.com will have a little bit more about that. Anything else? In the back.
How do you debug the custom types of provider?
Hang on, I'm going to step back here. What was that?
How do you debug the custom type? I mean,
yeah. So how do you debug a custom provider? So actually, the other thing that's in here, and I don't know, is it actually on the slide? Oh, as a matter of fact, look at that. I even very very quietly stuck a debug statement in. The provider, kind of API defines a function to use. So when you extend a, kind of go back here. So just like most programming languages, here a custom provider is actually extending something called the Puppet type, and you have access to methods that are in that type. So in this case, you ask, how do I debug something, or how do I start putting in statements of output? There actually are a couple things, and again, docs.puppetlabs.com will list all these things out. But here's an example. If you want to set something to a debug level, you can actually call a function called debug with a little bit of text output. So while you're developing and you're essentially writing your Puppet code and doing an execution, either through a Puppet apply or or a Vagrant run or whatever it might be, if you run it in debug mode, you'll actually see this get kicked out into the apply logs, the Puppet run itself. So it'll give you a little bit of insight into what's going on, while Puppet is running. You can run it in debug mode. You can also have info and warning. There's different debug levels you can run, Puppet apply or Puppet master to let you know that. Does that answer your question? Kind of. I suppose the next question would probably be, how do I do this within an IDE like IntelliJ or something? So yeah, the answer to that one would be, the answer that I have is that if you have a lot of things that you're trying to do within IntelliJ, or something Ruby IDE, you're doing something big and complicated. Because you have access to the Ruby programming language, you can actually write objects, classes, and most importantly, you can write spec tests. So you can write spec tests or Ruby unit or whatever your unit testing choice is if you are a Ruby programmer. Again, it's kind of a little bit of program design. Separate out those things from these things, and this is just Ruby code, so it will run with unit test suites. In the back.
Do you run into any weird things when you're doing that? Like, do you need,
What was that?
do you run into any weird things when you're doing that? Can you just run straightforward aspect tests, or do you need to load some Puppet stuff to handle?
Oh, yeah, you actually, you do need to make sure that some of the Puppet stuff is in your module path, per se, when you're running those kinds of things. So, yeah, just making sure that the Ruby libraries are available to the test runtime, per se, when you're doing those kinds of things. So you do need to, make sure that your runtime environment is set up with the Puppet gems included and things like that.
Do you have like another example you suggest somebody might look at who's looking for something that's more of a procedural routine, like some of the things you suggested earlier, like what the database migration might do? Like I'm looking at this, I think you just gave a really simple, trivial example, but like I'm thinking in my head, well, why don't you just wrap that little binary up in a package, sure it's installed.
Yeah.
So I
Oh, yeah.
my head around.
Oh, okay. Well, so I guess the short answer is no. I don't particularly have one on hand. I've done some of these where you're kind of doing it. So essentially you're connecting to a database and you're doing those kinds of things. It's not particularly anything I can share, unfortunately. So yeah, I apologize. Maybe we can find some good examples, or somebody else knows of some better examples that do those things, or I can see if I can. What we can do.
Somewhat object-like, or we use it in an instant class variable for the URL. And I guess my point is that for some administrators, they use procedure languages. They're not used to object-oriented concepts. So, what type of resource do you suggest that the person understand the OE concepts to the resource that online that allows people to write custom types, examples like laws, and get them to speak.
Oh, okay. I guess, matter of fact, so there's, I'll answer the second question first, which is, do I have examples of blogs or anything? So there's, so docs.puppetlab.com, custom types and writers, is a pretty good write-up. There's also one, and actually, I'll try and make a mental note of this, but I'll add the links to the GitHub. There's actually another, two really good posts by Puppet Labs, Gary Rizzo. Is that how you pronounce his name? So Gary Rizzo has a couple of very good blog posts on getting started with using custom types and providers, and he's using it to do some network configuration, which is a little more complicated than this example. The only warning is he likes to swear a lot. So can be a little not safe for question.
Say out loud the name of Gary's blog.
Oh, what's the shit Gary says blog? Yes, that's what it is.
Greg Dunn has some good ones too.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll try and make a mental note of this. I'll try and add it to that little GitHub README so it's there at that URL. I can just put up so you can just kind of link off to that rather than searching curse words on the internet. Any other questions or
Why did you kill off fresh meat?
why did we kill off? I was going to say, so So here's one where I probably need to shut off the mic. But you see, I kind of made a little joke about it. We're the evil corporate overlords per se. Yeah, find me during beer time and we'll talk about fresh. The official answer, if you have questions, Jennifer Bewley at Dice, jennifer.bewley@dice.com would be happy to answer any questions in the meeting. Right. Any other questions or just about, because I guess we have, it's nearly raffle time, so, yeah, if you, any.
You do more with this here than just install the package, like make some of the commands that are CLI available through public?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you can. And I kind of have this, so here's my apology to the Puppet Labs folks, is I actually have a little something that does that. But it's kind of in a rough state, and I'm going to publish it to the Forge one of these days. Yeah, just because there are certain things that I do with this thing, like WPCLI, and I have something called the WordPress method, where it downloads WordPress and kind of initializes it. Yeah, you can do some updating things. You can do anything that's in WPCLI.org. You can either do this way, or actually once it's installed, you can even, sometimes it's more than it's just a command, so you just may stick with a defined type, rather than going to full-blown moving app or something. But yeah, as a matter of fact, it's kind of, it's one of those half-done side projects that someday I'm just going to have to ship it and be done with it for a second.